We are back in Calvin's Tormentors. This is a book by Gary W. Jenkins. And we are in chapter 10, which is the last chapter before you get to the little brief conclusion he has at the back. Chapter 10 is entitled The Radicals, Italia as More Trouble Than Iberia. So we'll just summarize chapter 10 as we've begun summarizing the different chapters of the books we're going through. So in chapter 10, Jenkins turns from the Spanish heretic Michael Servetus, and he makes a striking claim that Italia proved a greater source of trouble than Iberia. So Servetus may have burned hot and brief, but the Italians, Jenkins argues, spawned a movement whose echoes endured far beyond the 16th century. So the story begins with Matteo Gribaldi. Matteo Gribaldi. Gribaldi was a jurist, like Calvin, moving cautiously under various pseudonyms. Yet his ideas seeped into Northern Europe, and very sadly, much of which that was in Poland. So the chapter starts out with a story of a Polish student by the name of Michael Zaleski. Michael was murdered in 1559, and investigators of that murder found among his belongings a manuscript of Gribaldi's Declaratio. Jenkins observes that this discovery revealed a, quote, a chain linking the anti-Trinitarian theology of the Italian radicals and the future Unitarian Church of Poland. For Calvin, Gribaldi embodied the Italian menace, educated, elusive, and destabilizing. Next comes Francisco, these are Italians, Francisco Stancaro. Stancaro was an Italian theologian who made Christ's mediatorship his central concern. He insisted that Christ acted as mediator only according to his humanity, not his divinity. This, of course, provoked heated debates across Protestant lands, for it seemed to undermine the unity of Christ's person. Jenkins notes that Stancaro, quote, became a theological gadfly, provoking disputes not only with Catholics, but also with his fellow Protestants. His case illustrates how Italian radicals did not all march in unison. Some, like Stancaro, carved out idiosyncratic positions that nonetheless added to the turbulence that Calvin was facing there in the 16th century. So after Stancaro, Jenkins brings us to someone named Giorgio Biandrata. Giorgio Biandrata, a physician. You're starting to notice a theme here. Stancaro was a jurist or a lawyer. Biandrata was a physician. Miguel Servetus was a physician as well. So you get this influx of doctors and lawyers who tend to deviate from orthodoxy. So Biandrata was a physician who carried his radical theology also into Poland, and then onward into Transylvania. And Jenkins paints him as a consummate strategist. He writes, quote, Biandrata's genius lay less in speculation than in maneuver, less in theology than in politics. Biandrata knew how to win patrons, and he knew how to navigate courts, and he was very gifted at embedding his heterodox teachings where he could find protection. For Geneva, this was not only alarming, it was terrifying. Radicals were not just dreamers, but they were organizers that had a very significant influence. So after Biandrata stood Girolamo Varro. Jenkins doesn't linger long here, but his inclusion of Girolamo shows the breadth of the Italian circle. They were not solitary figures, but a network. Varro represents those lesser known but significant voices who carried the same questions and critiques into the different Protestant lands, much of which was in Eastern Europe. So another of those was Paul Alciati. Alciati, like Gribaldi, was a jurist, so another lawyer. Jenkins remarks, the radical Italian movement owed much to its lawyers, men who wielded forensic precision to undo centuries of doctrinal consensus. Though not as famous as Socinus, Alciati sharpened the arguments that Calvin and his allies would have to later counter. And in a sense, that's kind of the nature of this book. The subtitle was Understanding the Conflicts That Shaped the Reformer. So Gribaldi, Alciati, all of these men forced the reformers to sharpen their views with more and more precision. So then Jenkins moves on to the more dramatic case of Valentius Gentilis. Valentius Gentilis. Gentilius, Gentili, or Gentilinus, it can pronounce different ways. Gentilinus pressed the doctrine of the Trinity so far apart that his teaching fairly undisputably turned into tritheism. And it was for this that the Bernese executed him in 1566. Jenkins notes when talking about this, quote, his death demonstrated that Geneva was not alone in defending orthodoxy. The Swiss cantons, too, saw in the Italians a threat grave enough to merit the sword. And by contrast, Laelius Socinus was an Italian, or Laelius Socini, or Socini was his Italian version. Everyone had the compulsion to change their names into Latin names. Socini was far more circumspect, according to Jenkins. He was living quietly in Basel. He traveled widely. He asked a lot of questions. He was always asking questions, but he never published anything outright heretical. And Jenkins writes that Laelius contented himself with hints and queries, content to leave others to reap where he had sown. Calvin saw in him a danger not of open revolt, but of more of an insidious corrosion. And then finally comes his nephew, Faustus Socinus. You know, Faustus, this is where Socinianism comes. Laelius' nephew was Faustus Socinus, but unlike his uncle, Faustus became a systematizer. And Jenkins describes him as the true architect of Socinianism, the man who gave body to what had been before the shadow and suggestion. Faustus in Poland found very fertile ground, crafting a theology that denied the Trinity, and it redefined Christ's work, and it spread across Europe. And as Jenkins concludes in this chapter, Servetus died in Geneva, but the Italians lived on in Poland and Transylvania, ensuring that Italia would be remembered as more dangerous than Iberia. So in conclusion, I think at this point it's worth noting the author, the perspective of Jenkins himself, because he is writing as an Eastern Orthodox, from the Eastern Orthodox tradition. He is an Eastern Orthodox scholar. He's a historian, but in this chapter, more than any of the other chapters, his bias becomes especially clear. And I'll read a few quotes of his that begin, well, they're all throughout the chapter, but on page 151 he writes, for instance, quote, referring to Calvin, quote, posited a completely arbitrary Christ, and one who was also composita persona, and not purely the second person of the Trinity. He adds that, quote, "It is not the second person of the Trinity who is mediator, but now to tertium quid, namely the fictive mediator who is less than the Father on some level, and divine justice that becomes mediator." And Jenkins doesn't stop there. He describes Calvin's, quote, "muddled Christology, one that struggled with a composite Christ that had an autothean person, keeping his divine righteousness at infinite arm's length from the objects of the covenant." And so for Jenkins, this means that Calvin needed a mediator of a covenant that was purely legal, and that it was purely impersonal. It wasn't a reconciliation to the two persons of the Trinity that was in view, but a reconciliation to divine justice. And Jenkins concludes starkly that Calvin's particular approach, or peculiar approach, to Christ's mediatorial work opened the door for a more detailed Unitarianism of Faustus Socinus, the prelude of deism that formed the seedbed of Diderot's later thought. So these aren't the words of a neutral historian. They reflect Jenkins' commitment to Orthodox conviction, contrasting Calvinist Christology with what Orthodoxy sees as a fuller and more integrated doctrine. But for a Reformed reader, this means we have to weigh his analysis a little bit carefully. We all have our biases. Jenkins offers a vivid account of Calvin's tormentors, but his lens is not the lens of the Reformed tradition. His criticisms say as much about his theological traditions as they do about Calvin's. So with that, we come to the end of the final full chapter of Jenkins' book, Calvin's Tormentors. The next video that we'll transition into will be the final conclusion that Jenkins offers, which is a very short chapter, but one of the most dense in content. So we'll give it a chance to reflect on the overall thrust of the work. But before we end there, I just want to talk about Jenkins' critique, his critique of Calvin's Christology. It's a glorious alliteration, from a Reformed perspective. Jenkins says Calvin posited, quote, "a completely arbitrary Christ, and one who was also composita persona, and not purely the second person of the Trinity." He's accusing Calvin of arbitrariness, grounding Christ's mediatorship in God's will or covenant rather than an eternal ontological necessity. Composite person, or the composita persona that Jenkins mentions. So he's suggesting that Calvin confuses the hypostatic union, making Christ a third thing, a tertium quid, rather than the eternal Son incarnate. For the Orthodox theologian, it looks like Calvin is too bound to these legal categories and covenantal frameworks, which is, he's a lawyer, so it's easy to criticize. That's what Calvin is doing. And so Christ's mediation from that perspective is impersonal rather than relational. That's the ironic thing from a Reformed perspective. So the Reformed response, a Reformed theologian would answer in at least three ways. One, Calvin clearly affirms the hypostatic union. Far from teaching a composite person, Calvin consistently and frequently says the mediator is the eternal Son who assumed human nature. And Calvin writes on that at length in Book 2 of his Institutes, which I have right here. Book 2 of it, this is the McNeil translation. So it's in the first volume, but it's Book 2, and it's chapter 14 of Book 2, and it's section 1. We can just start there. This is an example where Calvin writes, "On the other hand, we ought not to understand the statement of the statement that the Word was made flesh, John 1:14, in the sense that the Word was turned into flesh or confusedly mingled with flesh. Rather, it means that Because he chose for himself the virgin's womb as a temple in which to dwell, he who was the Son of God became the Son of Man, not by confusion of substance, but by unity of person. For we affirm his divinity so joined and united with his humanity that each retains its distinctive nature unimpaired. And yet these two natures constitute one Christ. So Calvin doesn't posit a tertium quid. The hypostatic union is safeguarded. One person, two natures, without any confusion or division, right? He couldn't be any more clear. The second charge was his charge, Jenkins' charge of arbitrariness, which we would argue misunderstands the covenantal framework. Calvin stresses God's freedom and initiative in establishing the covenant of grace. It doesn't mean that Christ's mediatorship is arbitrary. It just reflects God's consistent character. Mercy and justice are harmonized. Reformed orthodoxy emphasizes divine simplicity. There's no contradiction between the will of God and the being of God. The third point here is that Reformed scholastics refined Calvin quite a bit. They developed upon the foundation which he laid. But later Reformed theologians like Beza, Calvin's successor there in Geneva, Polanus, Turretin, Owen, Vitzius, they all systematized Calvin's insights, and they addressed exactly this kind of objection. They distinguished between the person of the mediator, the eternal Son, and the office of mediation taken up in the incarnation, so that Christ mediates not as a third being, but as the Son in his assumed humanity. So, if you want to read more responses from a Reformed tradition against these sorts of objections, because they're raised with regularity within the Eastern tradition, Calvin's Institutes, we just read from Book 2. We read from chapter 14, but if you go back to chapter 12, all the way to chapter 17, Calvin discusses Christ's person and work as mediator. Francis Turretin in his Institutes of Eclectic Theology, Volume 1, it's for Turretin, it's Volume 1, and it's topic 13, which is the person and office of Christ, the mediator. Turretin, in that volume, carefully rejects the idea of a tertium quid. Herman Vitzius, on his Economy of the Covenants, this is in Book 2, he shows how covenant theology secures both the divine initiative and Christ's personal mediation. And then Richard Muller, whom I love dearly, I love his work. We're working through in another video series his book, Calvin and the Reformed Tradition. So if you go and look at chapters 6 and 7, Muller discusses the various misunderstandings, of which Jenkins alludes, in Calvin's Christology and the development of Reformed Orthodox thought. And then there's Brannon Ellis. Brannon Ellis's book, Calvin, Classical Trinitarianism and the Aseity of the Son, where Brannon Ellis shows that Calvin's Christology stands within the Nicene tradition and not outside it. I mentioned John Owen earlier. So John Owen's The Person of Christ, not the abridged version. Read the full version if you can get that. It's available free online, but Owen is particularly talented at clarifying how the hypostatic union avoids both the Nestorian division and the Eutychian confusion. So in summary, a Reformed response is that Calvin did not posit an arbitrary composite Christ. He affirmed the one eternal Son as mediator, working through his human nature. Jenkins seems to be reading Calvin's covenantal framing through an orthodox lens, and then, of course, he's going to mistake it for confusion. The Reformed tradition, from Calvin onward, has carefully distinguished person and office to protect against exactly the error that Jenkins is accusing Calvin of. That's the irony. So I'll put this text up. These are some notes I kind of drafted. from a Reformed response where we're looking at person versus office. So Calvin onward, the Reformed were careful to distinguish, one, the person of the mediator, which is the eternal Son, the second person of the Trinity, who assumes human nature, and the office of mediator, which are the roles Christ took upon in the covenant of redemption, prophet, priest, and king, which he exercises according to both natures. So while Christ acts as mediator according to his humanity, since he suffers and obeys in our place, it is still the person of the Son who mediates. There's no composite person or tertium quid. The error Jenkins accuses Calvin of is collapsing this distinction, as if Calvin taught that the mediator was a new composite entity rather than the eternal Son acting in his office. It's almost hard to take this serious. The Reformed response is that Calvin did not, in fact, confuse person and office. His successors, like Beza, Polanus, Sertin, Owen, Vitius, explicitly clarified this distinction to prevent that very misreading. Okay, that's it for chapter, the last chapter here in Calvin's Tormentors. I think that was chapter 10. The conclusion is only a few pages, but it's dense. So I will segment that into a final video. Have a great day.